She went on a blind date, but didn't know it would be with a millionaire CEO, and when she finds out her secret, he's left speechless. Before we get started, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more life-changing stories like this one. And comment on where in America you're watching from. I like the story. Emily Clark had always thought blind dates were a waste of time. She wasn't a romantic, at least not in the way her friends were. They believed in fate, in destiny, and in that magical spark when two souls connected. Emily? She believed in numbers, schedules, and surviving another day at the office. But when her best friend Sarah pushed her to give it a try, Emily, after much hesitation, agreed. One night out. Just to see what it's like. Sarah insisted. So here she was. Standing outside a posh restaurant in Manhattan, her nerves buzzing despite her best efforts to stay composed. The evening air was cool, carrying the sounds of city traffic, but Emily hardly noticed. She smoothed her dress, a simple navy blue shift, trying to steady her breath. It wasn't like her to feel this anxious. She was an expert at keeping things together, at keeping up appearances. A glance at the time told her she was just a few minutes early. With a sigh, Emily walked into the restaurant, the plush red carpet beneath her feet making a soft sound with each step. The place was elegantly quiet, with chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and dim lighting that created an atmosphere both intimate and upscale. It smelled of expensive wine and roasted meats. She felt underdressed, but there was no turning back now. Her heart raced as she scanned the room, searching for a face she'd never seen before, and then she saw him. Richard Lawson, tall, well-groomed, and undeniably handsome. He sat at a corner table near the windows, a glass of wine in his hand as he stared out at the city lights, lost in thought. The moment Emily's eyes locked onto him, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just his obvious wealth or his sharp suit that caught her attention. It was the way he carried himself, like he belonged in this world, as if he was untouchable. For a moment, she hesitated. Her stomach flipped with uncertainty. He looked far too polished, far too out of her league. What was she even doing here? Before she could overthink it any further, he turned toward her and caught her eye. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile, confident, but not overbearing. Emily's pulse quickened. Emily? His voice was calm, smooth, and a little deeper than she expected. She blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. Yes. Richard? She crossed the room toward him, each step feeling more uncertain than the last. That's me. He rose as she reached the table, extending a hand. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Emily shook his hand, surprised at the warmth of his grip, the strength in his fingers. He seemed confident in a way that was both attractive and intimidating. Nice to meet you too, she managed, taking a seat across from him. As soon as she sat down, the waiter arrived with a menu and a polite smile. Richard ordered a bottle of wine without hesitation, his voice smooth and authoritative. Emily couldn't help but feel out of place. She rarely drank wine, and the expensive choice he made only accentuated how far out of her element she was. She opted for a glass of water instead, hoping to keep the situation at least somewhat grounded. So, Richard began once the waiter left, leaning back in his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. Tell me about yourself. What do you do when you're not out on blind dates? His tone was casual, but there was an underlying curiosity there. Emily adjusted herself, trying to shake off the initial discomfort. I'm an executive assistant. Been working in the city for the last few years. She paused. Not the most exciting job, but it pays the bills. Richard's eyes twinkled with amusement, as if he found something about her candidness intriguing. I wouldn't say that's not exciting. You must be good at it if you're working in Manhattan. I try, Emily responded with a soft laugh. It's all about making sure the wheels keep turning, I guess. Richard nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip from his wine glass. I know the feeling. In my world, it's all about managing chaos. But it has its perks. He flashed her a charming smile, the kind that seemed to light up his entire face. They both fell into a natural rhythm of conversation. Richard was easy to talk to, smooth, charismatic, and effortlessly charming. He asked questions about her life, her job, and her interests, genuinely listening to her responses without interrupting. Emily found herself opening up more than she expected, her voice less guarded than usual. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about the mounting pressure from her family's debts or the demands of her daily grind. She was here, in this moment, with a man who was not only easy on the eyes but also strangely attentive. "Tell me," Richard said, his tone lighter now, "what's something you've always wanted to do, but never had the chance to?" Emily paused. That was a question she didn't get often. Most people asked about her career, her next steps professionally. But this was different. "I've always wanted to travel more," she admitted. "I never get the time to do it. Maybe someday." She trailed off, thinking about all the places she'd never visited. Richard studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Maybe someday could be sooner than you think," he said, his voice low. "You never know." The words sent a jolt through her, and she was suddenly aware of the intensity in his gaze. But before she could respond, the waiter returned with their meals, and they both momentarily shifted their attention away from the conversation. The night progressed, and despite the lingering awkwardness of the blind date, Emily found herself enjoying Richard's company more than she expected. He had an effortless way of making her feel at ease, like she wasn't just a secretary struggling to keep it together, but a person worthy of his attention. For a woman who rarely allowed herself to relax, this was both a welcome change and a bit of a mystery. As the evening drew to a close, Richard insisted on walking her outside. Emily hesitated for a moment, wondering if it would be too forward to just grab a cab and go home. But for some reason, she found herself agreeing. The brisk night air hit her face as they stepped onto the street, the city skyline glittering in the distance. It was late, but the streets were still alive with energy. "You're quiet all of a sudden," Richard said, his voice warm. "Penny for your thoughts?" Emily smiled softly, trying to shake off the lingering feeling that she was in over her head. "Just thinking about how I never thought I'd be on a date like this," she confessed. He chuckled, his smile widening. "I get that. I don't usually do blind dates either. But I'm glad I made an exception tonight." "Me too," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. Richard stepped closer, his gaze shifting to her lips for a moment before he leaned in, just enough to place a light kiss on her cheek. It was quick, but it lingered, and Emily's heart fluttered in response. "Good night, Emily." "I'll call you," he said softly, his voice carrying a promise of something more. As he walked away, Emily stood still for a moment, watching him disappear into the night. Her mind raced, her thoughts tangled between uncertainty and curiosity. She had no idea where this night would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was willing to find out. Emily walked back to her apartment that night, her mind racing. The warm glow of the city lights reflected in the wet pavement, but it was Richard's face, with his confident, charismatic smile, that lingered in her mind. The evening had been a strange mix of comfort and discomfort. For the first time in a long while, she had felt at ease with someone outside her circle, someone who wasn't weighed down by the same daily struggles she was used to. But that feeling also stirred something else, a sense of guilt. As much as she wanted to believe that she could just enjoy the night and forget about everything that burdened her, she couldn't shake the reality of her situation. Her family's debt. The constant calls from creditors. The looming threats that came with every unpaid bill. No amount of wine, good food, or charming conversation could erase that pressure. Yet, Richard made it so easy to forget, even if only for a few hours. The next few days were a blur of work and personal turmoil. Richard had called her the following afternoon, much to her surprise, asking if they could meet for coffee. She had hesitated for a moment before agreeing, unsure if it was just another casual invitation or if there was something more beneath it. Either way, she needed the distraction. The coffee shop was cozy and warm, its large windows offering a view of the bustling street outside. As Emily walked in, she spotted Richard almost immediately. He was sitting by the window, a mug of coffee in front of him, scrolling through his phone. His presence, even in a simple setting like this, exuded a quiet confidence. It was strange, but she found herself looking forward to seeing him again, despite the fact that their connection had barely begun. He looked up when she entered, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Emily, you look beautiful," he said, his voice low and sincere. She felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thanks. You look casual," she teased, trying to break the tension, as she pulled out the chair opposite him. "I do try to mix things up occasionally," he replied with a grin, his eyes glinting with mischief. They both laughed, but Emily couldn't help but feel that under the lightness of the moment, there was an unspoken tension between them. She wasn't used to being pursued, at least not by someone like Richard Lawson, successful, powerful, and strikingly handsome. She had spent most of her life keeping her head down, working hard to make ends meet and protect her family. She was used to being the one who had to make things happen, not the one who was waited on, courted. "So tell me, Emily," Richard said, his voice shifting from playful to something more serious. "How's work been? How's everything going?" She hesitated for a moment, not wanting to unload her personal problems onto him. But his eyes were so open, so inviting, that it felt natural to share. It's been stressful," she admitted, her voice dropping slightly. "My family's been dealing with a lot lately. My parents, they've fallen behind on bills, and I've been trying to help them catch up. The debt is huge, and the creditors aren't exactly the forgiving type." She looked down at her coffee, feeling the familiar pang of anxiety rise in her chest. Richard's face softened as he listened, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of vulnerability pass between them. It was as if he understood more than she had anticipated. "You're carrying all of that on your shoulders alone?" Richard asked quietly, his tone turning serious. Emily shrugged, trying to play it off. "It's just part of being responsible, I guess." She let out a breath and changed the subject, not wanting to dwell on it any longer. But Richard wasn't so easily deterred. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm sorry, Emily. That sounds really tough. But you don't have to do this alone, you know." The words hit her like a freight train. She hadn't expected him to offer help, at least, not like this. Her instincts screamed at her to reject it, to push him away. She didn't want his charity, his pity, no matter how genuine his intentions seemed. "I appreciate the offer, Richard," she said, forcing a smile. "But I'm fine. I'm handling it." She picked up her coffee, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't want anyone's help." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. "Emily, I want to help. It's not about pity or charity. You don't need to struggle on your own. You're not weak for accepting help." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she wasn't some damsel in distress, but the words stuck in her throat. The truth was, she didn't want him to see her that way, didn't want him to think of her as someone incapable of handling her own problems. But she also didn't want to lose him, didn't want to lose the connection they were beginning to form. "I can't accept that kind of help," she said finally, her voice tight. "Not from you." Richard's expression softened, and he leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "I get it. But if you change your mind, I won't," she interrupted, a little too quickly. She cleared her throat. "I won't." There was a brief, tense silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was charged with an unspoken understanding. Richard nodded slowly, as if accepting her refusal, though Emily could see the disappointment in his eyes. "So, tell me more about your job," Richard said, shifting the conversation back to safer ground. As they continued to talk, the rest of the afternoon passed quickly. They discussed everything from favorite books to future aspirations, but the underlying tension, Emily's refusal to accept help and Richard's unyielding desire to be there for her, remained. She wasn't sure what she wanted from him, or if she even wanted anything at all. She wasn't used to letting people in, especially not someone like Richard. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment, the weight of her family's financial problems seemed even heavier than before. The conversation with Richard had stirred something inside her, something she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. It wasn't just the offer of help, it was the possibility that, in him, She might be seeing someone who could change everything. Someone who could offer her an escape from the life she had known. But could she really let herself accept that? The next few days felt like a blur to Emily. Her workdays were as long and demanding as ever, but her mind kept drifting back to the coffee with Richard. His words, his gaze, and especially his offer to help, none of it left her. It gnawed at her, an unwelcome reminder of how alone she felt in managing her family's overwhelming debt. She didn't want to admit it, but part of her was tempted. The other part, her pride, her stubbornness, refused to let her even consider the idea of accepting help from someone like Richard. He wasn't just anyone, he was a CEO, a man who had it all. Why would someone like him want to get involved with someone like her? But there was more to it than that. It wasn't just the pride or the hesitation, it was the fear of vulnerability. Over the years, she'd learned to protect herself, to keep her emotions locked away. Letting anyone into her chaotic world felt like giving up control. Richard had left her with his number, a promise of help, but no pressure. He had said he would be there if she needed him, and yet, Emily couldn't bring herself to reach out. The nights that followed were spent staring at the glowing screen of her phone, drafting and deleting messages to him, each one a silent cry for help, but ultimately too afraid to send. By the end of the week, Emily couldn't avoid Richard any longer. She found herself standing in the same trendy cafe where they had met, watching him enter with that signature air of confidence. He spotted her immediately and smiled, one of those smiles that made everything around him fade into the background. "Emily," Richard said, his voice warm and genuine. He approached her table with ease and sat down without waiting for her to invite him. There was something about the way he was so unafraid to be forward, something that made her feel both nervous and strangely reassured. "Hey," she replied, trying to mask the unease in her voice. "I wasn't sure if you'd reach out again." Richard raised an eyebrow. "You didn't think I would?" "I wasn't sure," she said honestly. "You're busy, I'm sure." She couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She had been avoiding him, even if she didn't mean to. He shook his head, smiling again. "It's not about being busy. It's about whether or not you want to see me again." Her heart skipped. His words weren't a casual invitation, they felt like an open challenge. It wasn't just about a coffee or a nice conversation anymore. He was pressing for something more, something Emily wasn't sure she was ready for. Before she could respond, Richard leaned in a bit closer, his voice quieter. "Look, Emily, I understand if you're not ready to let me in. But I'd like to help. I've seen what you're going through, and it's not easy." She flinched at the mention of her family's struggles. Richard must have seen it in her expression, because his eyes softened, and he quickly added, "I'm not asking you to put all your cards on the table. But I want you to know you don't have to carry everything alone." His sincerity hit her like a wave, but she pushed it away, forcing her emotions to retreat once more. "I don't need your help," she said, though her voice trembled with the words. "I can handle it." He stared at her for a long moment, almost as if he could see straight through the wall she had carefully built around herself. "I know you think you can," he said slowly, "but you don't have to." Emily looked away, feeling suddenly small under his gaze. She could feel the walls she had constructed around her life beginning to crumble. Every part of her screamed to pull back, to distance herself. But she couldn't shake the feeling that Richard wasn't going to let her. He wasn't like anyone else. The conversation drifted back to safer topics: work, movies, random life updates. But the underlying tension was palpable. As they finished their drinks, Emily couldn't help but feel the unease bubble in her chest, a mix of desire and resistance. She wanted to let him in, to confide in him, but that would require letting go of everything she'd built up. But she knew it wasn't just about her anymore. Her family was on the brink, and her own pride was starting to feel like an anchor around her neck. The phone calls from creditors were growing more frequent, the threats more direct. She had tried to keep up with the payments, but it was like a game of whack-a-mole. Every time she paid one debt, two more would appear. As they stood up to leave, Richard put a hand on her arm. The touch was gentle, but it felt like a connection, a tether pulling her back from the edge. "I'm serious, Emily," he said quietly. I'm here for you. Whatever you need. Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to smile. Thanks, Richard. I'll keep that in mind. But as she stepped out of the cafe and into the cold night air, she knew deep down that she was running out of time. Something had to give. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And as much as she resisted, she knew that Richard's offer was more than just a gesture. It was the lifeline she had been too proud to reach for. The following week was the hardest Emily had faced in a long time. Every day felt like she was walking through thick mud, slow, suffocating. Her mother called in a panic about a threatening letter from the bank. Her father's health had taken another turn for the worse, and the medical bills kept piling up. Every time she looked at her phone, she saw another missed call from an unfamiliar number, probably one of the creditors, each call more insistent than the last. But despite the chaos, there was a quiet, almost desperate part of her that began to long for Richard's presence. His words echoed in her mind, and each time she thought about reaching out to him, she felt the weight of her own resistance. She was afraid. Afraid of what might happen if she let him in, afraid of what might happen if she didn't. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of internal conflict, Emily picked up her phone one evening and found Richard's number. Her thumb hovered over the screen, and for a long moment she almost put the phone down again. But then she tapped it. The message was short, but it carried the weight of everything she had been holding back. I need help. The night Emily sent the message, her heart pounded in her chest. The simple sentence she had written felt like an irreversible decision, one that could unravel the carefully constructed walls she had spent years building around her. As soon as the message was sent, she regretted it. She almost reached for the phone to delete it, but before she could, the 3 dots indicating a response appeared on the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. A minute passed. Then 2. Finally, Richard's reply came, direct and reassuring. I'm here, Emily. Let's talk tomorrow. I'll make time. It was as if a dam had broken inside her. She closed her eyes, feeling a rush of emotions she had tried so hard to ignore. Part of her felt relief, like a heavy burden had been lifted, but another part, an anxious, defensive part, was terrified of what was coming next. She had agreed to meet him the following day, though she wasn't entirely sure what she would say. She had never been one to ask for help, let alone accept it. And yet here she was, about to sit down with Richard Lawson, the kind of man she had always thought she'd never need, or even want. The CEO, the businessman who controlled millions. What could someone like him possibly want with her? The question gnawed at her as she tossed and turned through the night. The next afternoon, Emily stood outside the restaurant Richard had chosen. It was a high-end establishment, sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that allowed anyone walking by to peek inside at the glittering interior. Emily paused in front of the entrance for a moment, unsure if she should walk in. She had worn a simple dress, nothing extravagant, but still, she felt out of place. It wasn't just the restaurant. It was everything. The feeling that she was slipping into a world she didn't belong in, a world where people like Richard moved with ease, and people like her merely watched from the outside. She sucked in a breath, straightened her posture, and entered the restaurant. Richard was already waiting for her. As soon as he saw her, he stood up and greeted her with that warm, knowing smile that she was beginning to recognize all too well. Emily, I'm glad you made it, he said, his voice smooth but somehow grounded. She nodded, trying to smile back. Thank you for meeting me. Of course. Let's sit down. I ordered a bottle of wine for us. You like red, right? He asked, his tone casual yet attentive. Red is fine, Emily replied, though the wine didn't really matter. What mattered was that she had come here, finally willing to confront the reality of her situation, and Richard's involvement in it. As they sat down, a waiter arrived with a glass of wine and set it down in front of each of them. Richard picked up his glass, swirling it gently, then took a small sip before looking back at Emily. So, he began. Talk to me. What's been going on, Emily? I know it's not easy to talk about, but I want to listen. Emily felt the weight of his gaze, and for a moment, her words stuck in her throat. How could she possibly explain everything? The pressure, the constant fear, the helplessness she had been hiding for months, no, for years. She took a deep breath, and the words finally started to flow. "My family's drowning in debt," she said, her voice steady but quiet. "And it's all on me. I've been trying to pay it off, to keep the creditors at bay, but it's just too much. Every time I think I can catch a break, another bill comes in, another threat." She paused, feeling the sting of tears behind her eyes. "It's like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." Richard watched her intently, his expression softening. He didn't interrupt, just let her speak, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like someone was truly listening to her. She wasn't alone in this. Finally, after a moment of silence, Richard spoke. "You don't have to carry all of this by yourself. Let me help. Let me take some of that burden off of you." Emily's stomach tightened. She could feel the panic rising in her chest. "No. I can't ask you to do that. I won't accept charity." "I'm not offering charity," Richard said, his tone unwavering. "I'm offering a partnership. A way for you to breathe again. You don't have to sacrifice yourself for the sake of your family. You deserve more than that, Emily." The way he said her name, it was different from how others said it. It was as if he was truly seeing her, understanding her in a way that no one had before. And that scared her. It scared her because she wasn't sure if she could handle it. "I don't know how this works," Emily said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I don't know how to accept help, Richard. I don't know how to let someone in." Richard smiled gently, setting his wine glass down. "It's not about letting me in, Emily. It's about allowing yourself to have peace, to not have to constantly fight against the tide. You've been fighting for so long. It's okay to rest." Rest. The word hit her like a shockwave. She didn't know what that felt like anymore. Rest had become a luxury she could no longer afford. "I've never known what it's like to not be fighting," she admitted quietly, looking down at the table. Richard's hand was on the table now, a few inches from hers. He didn't reach for her, but the proximity was enough to make her heart beat a little faster. "It's okay," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "You don't have to fight alone anymore. I can help you with your family's debts. I can make sure the creditors stop calling you. Let me do that for you. Let me be the person who's on your side." She swallowed hard, trying to process everything he was saying. Could she really do this? Could she really accept help from him, and from someone who could do so much more than just throw money at her problems? "I don't want you to think I'm weak," she whispered, her voice cracking despite herself. Richard's face softened, and without a word, he reached for her hand. His touch was warm, steady, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of safety. It was unexpected, and yet it felt right. "Emily," he said, his voice soothing. "You're not weak. You're stronger than you know. And accepting help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human." She looked up at him then, and for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to truly believe what he said. She wasn't weak. She was simply someone who had been fighting for far too long, and now, maybe it was time to stop. "I'll take your help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard squeezed her hand lightly, a smile spreading across his face. "Good. We'll figure this out together." The following week passed in a haze of decisions, plans, and endless phone calls. Emily wasn't sure if the relief she felt from accepting Richard's help was temporary or if it was something deeper, something more permanent. She had given him the details of her family's debts, the overwhelming creditors, and even the threats that had made her heart race every time she picked up the phone. Richard had promised to handle everything, and true to his word, the calls stopped. For the first time in ages, Emily didn't feel the suffocating weight of constant worry pressing down on her chest. But that didn't mean the other emotions, the ones she had tried to keep buried, weren't starting to surface. She had always been a logical person. She had prided herself on her ability to compartmentalize, to keep her emotions in check. But Richard was starting to change that. Every time she saw him, heard his voice, or simply felt his gaze on her, she felt something stir deep inside her. It wasn't just gratitude anymore, it was something else. Something that scared her. One afternoon, Richard invited her to his office to go over the final details of her family's debts. She agreed, though the thought of stepping into his world, his professional domain, made her nervous. His office building was a towering structure in the heart of the city, gleaming with modern glass and steel. As she stepped out of the elevator and into the sleek lobby, she felt like a fish out of water. She was used to the small, cozy office where she worked, not a world where every corner seemed to radiate wealth and power. Richard's assistant, a poised woman with dark hair and sharp eyes, greeted Emily immediately. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Lawson is expecting you. Right this way." Emily followed the assistant down a long hallway, the soft click of her heels echoing in the near silence. The doors opened to a spacious, minimalist office. The walls were lined with bookshelves, though instead of books, they were filled with abstract art pieces and sleek sculptures. The view from the window was breathtaking, spanning the city skyline. The world below seemed impossibly small. Richard stood by his desk, his back to her, as he gazed out the window. He was dressed in a tailored suit, looking every bit the CEO he was. As Emily entered, he turned, flashing her one of those effortless smiles that made her heart skip a beat. "Emily, I'm glad you could make it," he said, his voice calm and inviting. "Please, have a seat." She took a deep breath and sat down, trying to remain composed. "Thanks for having me. I don't know where to start." Richard took a seat across from her, leaning back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "Start with whatever feels right. There's no rush." Emily hesitated. What could she say? How could she explain everything without sounding like she was drowning in her own mess? Richard, however, didn't seem bothered by her silence. He waited patient, the warmth of his presence somehow making it easier for her to breathe. After a few moments, she spoke. I guess I'm still processing everything. You've done so much already, Richard, and I don't know how to repay you." "Repay me?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "I didn't do this for repayment, Emily. I did it because I want to help. And I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything." The sincerity in his voice struck her. She had always been so independent, so used to doing everything on her own, that it was hard for her to accept this kind of generosity. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. I don't know how to accept it. How do you just help someone without expecting something in return?" Richard's expression softened, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "It's not about expecting something in return, Emily. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to offer a hand when they're falling. You don't need to give anything back." Emily swallowed hard, his words digging into a part of her she hadn't realized was so fragile. She had always felt like she had to pay back every favor, every act of kindness. It was ingrained in her to never take anything for granted. But Richard was asking her to do something she wasn't sure she was capable of, to trust, to accept his help without strings attached. I want to trust you," she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. "I really do. But it's hard for me, Richard. I've spent so long doing everything on my own, I don't know how to let anyone else in." Richard's eyes softened even more, if that was possible. He stood up and walked around the desk to stand beside her. Without saying a word, he placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that was surprisingly comforting, but also electric. His touch was gentle, steady. "You don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, his voice soothing. "You can take your time. But you should know, Emily, you don't have to carry this weight alone anymore." For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself to lean into his touch, just for a fraction of a second. And in that second, something inside her shifted. She didn't feel weak for needing help, she felt human. She wasn't broken. She was just tired, and there was no shame in admitting that. Richard's hand slipped from her shoulder, and he gave her a small smile. "How about we take a break from all this business talk? I have a meeting in a couple of hours, but I'd like to take you to dinner afterward. Let's just enjoy the evening." Emily hesitated. The idea of spending time with Richard outside of a business setting was new to her, and honestly it made her nervous. But she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. She found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Dinner sounds nice," she said softly. Richard's smile widened. "Great. I'll have my assistant arrange something. We deserve a little break, don't you think?" As the meeting came to a close, Emily couldn't shake the strange sense of relief she felt. Not just about the financial matters, which were now under control thanks to Richard, but about the conversation they had just shared. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in the struggle. She had someone to lean on, even if she wasn't entirely sure what that meant for their relationship moving forward. Later that evening, they met at a small, intimate restaurant near the water. The ambience was relaxed, the sound of waves gently crashing against the shore filling the air. As they sat down at their table, the weight of the day seemed to melt away. Richard was no longer the CEO in his office, and Emily was no longer the secretary drowning in debt. They were just two people, sharing a meal and an unexpected connection. Emily felt her heart flutter again as they chatted about lighter things, travel, movies, places they'd always wanted to visit. Richard was easy to talk to, disarming in a way that made her feel comfortable even as her emotions began to stir once more. "So," Richard said, taking a sip of wine, "what's something you've always wanted to do but never had the chance to?" Emily thought for a moment. "I've always wanted to go to Italy. I've heard it's beautiful there, and there's so much history to see." Richard smiled. "Italy, huh? Maybe we'll take a trip there someday." Her heart skipped. There was something in the way he said it, so casual, yet the words held an unspoken promise. The idea of going somewhere with Richard, spending time with him outside the confines of work, outside of her family's crises, was both thrilling and terrifying. But tonight, Emily allowed herself to imagine it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something worth dreaming about. The following days after dinner with Richard felt like an emotional roller coaster to Emily. Despite the relief she'd felt in his company, a part of her kept resisting the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. She couldn't ignore the fact that her life was no longer as it had been. It was as though Richard had shifted the axis on which her world spun. She had known him for a while, but she hadn't truly known him until that night. She would lie awake at night, the quiet hum of the city outside her apartment window, thinking about how Richard's words, his touch, his presence, seemed to resonate in her. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It wasn't just about the financial help he was offering. It was something deeper, more visceral. And for the first time in years, she was scared of something that had nothing to do with the looming threat of creditors or her family's mounting debts. It was the feeling of wanting someone. One afternoon, Richard called her unexpectedly. Emily had just finished a long day of work, juggling multiple phone calls and trying to maintain a semblance of control. She had been trying, with all her might, to suppress the growing attraction she felt for him, but the phone call now threatened to shatter that fragile barrier. "Emily, how are you?" Richard's voice crackled through the line, warm and soothing, like the sound of rain after a storm. "I'm doing okay, just busy," she replied, trying to keep things neutral. "What's up?" "I was thinking we could talk, just the two of us. Maybe we could meet up for a drink or something after work. I know things have been pretty intense for you lately. It might help to get away from all of this." Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the emotions she had been fighting so hard to avoid, but the idea of spending more time with Richard, of simply being around him, was undeniably appealing. The temptation was too strong. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself. "Where?" "There's a bar near my place. Not far from here. You'll like it. It's low-key, but I think it's exactly what we both need." She agreed to meet him an hour later, and as she prepared for the evening, Emily found herself in front of the mirror, unsure of what to wear. Her outfit had to be simple, but it had to be just enough. Not too much, but enough for Richard to notice. The pull between being vulnerable and being guarded was a tug-of-war she couldn't win. When Emily arrived at the bar, the dim lighting made the atmosphere feel intimate, private, even though the space itself was alive with conversation and laughter. She spotted Richard immediately. He was sitting at the bar, his profile outlined by the soft amber light that glinted off his glass. She took a deep breath before making her way to him, her heart already picking up pace. "Hey!" she greeted him, her voice slightly shaky despite her best efforts to appear calm. "This place is nice." Richard turned with that smile of his, the one that always made her stomach do somersaults. "Glad you like it. I thought it might be a good escape for both of us." She sat down beside him, and as she did, the distance between them seemed to narrow. They had both been through a lot lately, emotionally, professionally, and yet there was a subtle, unspoken understanding that seemed to build with every passing second. Emily couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something undeniably magnetic between them now. "What's been on your mind, Emily?" Richard asked, his voice surprisingly soft. She wasn't prepared for the directness of the question. He always seemed to be able to see through her defenses, to peer into the places where she hid her true self. She had tried to guard her emotions, to compartmentalize her life, but Richard wasn't easily deterred. He was persistent, and perhaps that was exactly what she needed. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the drink in front of her. "About how much you've done for me, for my family, and I'm not sure I can accept it." Richard's expression softened. He didn't push her. He didn't pressure her to say anything more than she was ready to, but his presence was enough to make her feel safe in her vulnerability. "I didn't do it to make you feel indebted," he said after a moment, his voice unwavering. "I did it because I want to help. Because you don't deserve to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders alone. And because I care about you, Emily." The last part of his sentence hung in the air like a delicate thread. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come out the way she expected. Her emotions were overwhelming her now, every wall she had ever built crumbling to the floor. "You're not the only one who's struggling," she finally said, her voice trembling. Sometimes I don't know how to ask for help, how to accept it. But that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is letting myself need someone. Letting someone in." Richard's eyes locked with hers, his gaze intense, filled with something that made her breath hitch in her throat. He didn't look away, didn't flinch, just waited for her to continue. "I'm scared, Richard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared of needing you." Richard reached out, his hand gently resting on hers, the contact so simple, yet so powerful. "You don't need to be scared, Emily. You don't need to be afraid of needing anyone. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Emily felt the weight of his words sink deep into her chest. It was as though he had unlocked a part of her she didn't even know existed. The floodgates opened, and she realized how much she had been holding back, not just from him, but from herself. "I'm not asking you to solve all my problems," she said, the words more confident now. "But I need to stop pretending that I can handle everything on my own." Richard's grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly, his thumb brushing over her skin in a comforting rhythm. "I'm not here to solve everything. I'm here to be by your side. And that's all I can offer, Emily." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about debts or crises anymore. It was about two people acknowledging the undeniable connection that had formed between them, something they both had been fighting to understand. And as Emily looked into Richard's eyes, she saw something there, a depth, a sincerity, that made her heart beat faster. The evening passed in quiet conversation and laughter. The world outside seemed to fade as they spent time together, their connection deepening with each word spoken, each glance shared. But as the night wore on, Emily couldn't ignore the undercurrent of something else, something that had been there from the very beginning. She didn't know where this would lead, but one thing was certain: her life had irrevocably changed. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop fighting it. The days following their night out seemed to blur into one another for Emily. She had been living in a limbo of emotions, a strange mixture of gratitude, fear, and something more. Richard had managed to shatter the walls she had so carefully built around herself, and although it terrified her, it also brought a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. But as the days passed, the weight of the situation she found herself in began to sink in once more. Her family's financial troubles weren't just numbers on a page. They weren't just debts that could be paid off with money from an investor or a simple loan. They were threats, promises of ruin, and Emily had spent the better part of her adult life trying to avoid them. Richard's presence in her life had softened the blow, but the reality of her situation hadn't changed. And deep down, she knew she couldn't hide from it forever. Her phone rang early one afternoon while she was at the office. She glanced at the caller ID and immediately felt her stomach knot. It was her mother's number. Emily picked it up, bracing herself for whatever news awaited her. "Emily," her mother's voice cracked over the phone. We've got another letter. The collectors are threatening to come by again." Her heart sank. "Mom, I told you to stop answering their calls. I'm doing everything I can." I know," her mother said, her voice shaking. "But these people, they don't care. They say they're going to take everything. What do we do, Emily?" The panic in her mother's voice only deepened Emily's own sense of helplessness. She had thought Richard's intervention had bought her time, but her family's debts were like a shadow that loomed over everything, darkening every corner of her life. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother everything was going to be fine, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. "I'll take care of it," Emily said, her voice steady, even though she felt anything but. Just don't answer the door, okay? I'll handle it." She hung up the phone, her hands shaking as she stared at the screen. Her mind raced. The sense of control she had once felt, the small victories she had clung to, were slipping away, like sand through her fingers. She could feel Richard's words echoing in her head, "You don't have to carry this weight alone anymore." But how could she ask him to take on her burdens? How could she let him into this part of her life? There was no way she could drag him into the mess her family had created. Later that evening, Emily found herself pacing her apartment. She had tried to focus on work, but the thought of the creditors, the looming threats, and her mother's voice kept returning to her. She was exhausted, mentally and emotionally, but there was no escaping it. She couldn't run away from her responsibilities. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it, half hoping it would be Richard. It wasn't. It was a text from her mother. "They said they'll be here tomorrow. Please help us." Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the message. She had promised her mother she would take care of everything, but the reality was that she had no idea how to fix things. At the same moment, Richard was in his office, reviewing contracts and preparing for upcoming meetings. His thoughts, however, kept drifting back to Emily. Ever since their dinner, he had been consumed with thoughts of her. The walls she had built around herself were slowly crumbling, but there was still a sense of hesitation, a lingering uncertainty that she hadn't fully opened up to him. He had been patient, giving her space, but he couldn't deny the growing sense of urgency he felt. He knew that the more he tried to give her, the more she pulled away. He had watched her wrestle with her emotions, saw how she struggled with accepting help, with trusting anyone. It was a struggle he understood all too well. Richard had been the person who always took charge, who never let anyone see his vulnerabilities. But with Emily, everything felt different. She made him want to break through the walls of his own self-imposed isolation. But she wasn't ready. At least, not yet. As the night wore on, Richard found himself staring at his phone, contemplating whether he should reach out to her. But before he could decide, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Can we talk?" The words, so simple yet so loaded, caused a strange mix of relief and concern to surge through him. He didn't hesitate. Of course. "Whenever you're ready." Richard's response was immediate, but he knew deep down that whatever Emily was about to say, it would change things between them. An hour later, Emily arrived at Richard's apartment. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for: answers, comfort, or maybe just someone to share her burden with. The weight of everything had become unbearable, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't want to carry it alone. When she stepped into Richard's apartment, she was struck by the quiet calm of the place. It was everything his office wasn't: warm, personal, inviting. Richard greeted her with a soft smile, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for the words she hadn't yet spoken. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "You look like you've been through the ringer." Emily offered a small smile but didn't respond. She walked in, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Richard closed the door behind her and moved toward the kitchen. "I can make us something to drink," he offered. "Wine? Tea? Wine sounds good," Emily replied, her voice barely a whisper. As Richard poured the wine, Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore, Richard. It's like no matter how hard I try, I can't fix anything. The debt keeps piling up, and every time I think I've caught a break, something else happens." Richard turned to face her, the glass of wine in his hand. He studied her for a long moment before setting the glass down and walking over to where she stood. "You don't have to fix it all, Emily," he said gently, his hands reaching out to take hers. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." For the first time, Emily felt the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill over. She blinked rapidly, but it was no use. The emotions she had buried for so long were finally coming to the surface. "I don't know how to let go of control," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I've always been the one to hold everything together, but now, I don't know if I can." Richard's gaze softened, and he pulled her into his arms. "You don't have to be in control of everything, Emily. You don't have to be the one who fixes everything. I'm here for you. You don't have to do it all alone." As Richard held her, Emily allowed herself to let go, if only for a moment. She didn't have to be strong all the time. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world by herself. In that moment, surrounded by Richard's warmth and unwavering support, Emily realized that maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to let someone else in. To trust. To be vulnerable. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Emily's small apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. Despite the bright day outside, she could feel a coldness creeping in around her heart. It had been several days since the conversation at Richard's place, and while part of her felt lighter for having let her guard down, another part of her remained cautious, hesitant to embrace the vulnerability she had started to share. The wine from that night still lingered in her memory, along with Richard's words. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore." It was a sentiment she hadn't fully understood, nor had she ever really allowed herself to believe. Life, for Emily, had always been about survival. Growing up with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders had taught her that asking for help was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet, now, there was Richard. She still couldn't quite figure him out. Everything about him seemed to defy her understanding. He was everything she'd never expected: charming, confident, successful, yet incredibly patient. Where most men might have been impatient with her coldness or emotional walls, Richard had only offered warmth and understanding. He seemed to get her in ways she couldn't articulate, and with every day, it seemed as though he was inching closer to her heart. But could she truly let someone like him in? The sound of her phone ringing pulled her from her thoughts. The caller ID flashed. "Mom!" And Emily's heart sank. She had been avoiding her mother's calls since their last conversation. There was only so much she could handle at once. With a sigh, Emily answered the phone. "Mom," she said softly. "What is it?" "Emily, it's bad." Her mother's voice was tight, filled with distress. "The creditors, they're here. They came by the house today. They said if we don't pay up, they're going to take everything. I don't know what to do. Please, you've got to help us. I can't handle this on my own." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. The sense of urgency in her mother's voice filled her with dread. "I'll be there in an hour," she said, her voice shaking. "Stay calm, Mom. I'll figure something out." She hung up and stared at the phone in her hand, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. This wasn't just about debts anymore. This was about her family's future. Her mother had no way of making it through this alone, and Emily couldn't let her face it without some sort of solution. But how could she fix this? She had no magic answer. No miracle. But then Richard's face flashed through her mind. She remembered how he had been there for her the other night, holding her while she cried, offering support without hesitation. Maybe it was time to stop pretending that she could do it all herself. Maybe it was time to trust him. Later that day, Emily found herself in Richard's sleek downtown office, her nerves on edge. She had never imagined she would be sitting in a place like this, let alone asking Richard for help. But here she was, sitting across from him, trying to summon the words she needed. "I don't know where else to turn," Emily began, her voice quiet, almost apologetic. "My family's in deeper than I thought. The creditors are threatening to take everything. And I just don't know what to do." Richard's expression didn't waver. His brow furrowed slightly, but he kept his eyes steady on hers. "I told you, you don't have to carry this burden alone, Emily. We'll figure it out." She swallowed hard, her chest tightening. "I don't want to be a burden to you. I know you're trying to help, but I don't want you to feel like you have to fix everything." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I'm not fixing anything, Emily. You're not a burden. You're just someone who's going through a tough time, and I'm here for you. I want to be here for you." The sincerity in his voice made her heart race, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe his words. Maybe he wasn't just saying them out of obligation. Maybe he meant it. "I don't even know how to ask for help," Emily admitted, her voice wavering slightly. It feels so wrong to let someone else carry a part of this weight." Richard's gaze softened. He stood and walked over to where she was sitting, coming to stand beside her. "It's not about carrying the weight for you, Emily. It's about standing with you. It's about facing the storm together." For the first time, Emily felt something shift inside her. She had spent so many years pushing people away, convincing herself that she was fine on her own. But Richard wasn't asking her to be fine. He wasn't asking her to do it alone. "Let me help," he said quietly. "Not because you need to be fixed, but because I care about you." She nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to argue, to say that she didn't need his help, that she could handle this. But the truth was, she didn't want to be alone anymore. And Richard wasn't like the others. He wasn't trying to control her or take over her life. He just wanted to be there for her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Richard replied. "Just let me help." For a long moment, they stood there, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. Then, Richard gently placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture so simple yet so profound. "I'm with you, Emily," he said softly. "We'll figure this out together." The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, meetings with financial advisors, and endless hours spent negotiating with creditors. Richard's presence in Emily's life had become more than just a comfort. He was a stabilizing force, guiding her through the chaos with calm and unwavering support. It was more than she had ever imagined. She had always expected to face her battles alone, but Richard was there, every step of the way. As the situation with her family's debts started to resolve, Emily found herself grappling with new emotions. She had always been so fiercely independent, so determined to avoid depending on anyone. But now, she was faced with the reality that Richard wasn't just helping her out of pity or obligation. He was doing it because he genuinely cared about her. One evening, after another long day of dealing with paperwork and phone calls, Emily and Richard found themselves sitting together on the balcony of his apartment, overlooking the city lights. There was a quiet peace between them now, an unspoken understanding that hadn't been there before. "I don't know how to thank you for all of this," Emily said, her voice soft yet full of emotion. "You've done more for me than I could ever repay." Richard smiled, his gaze tender as he looked at her. "You don't need to repay me, Emily. Just let me be here for you. That's enough for me." The silence between them was comfortable, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emily felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and though there were still challenges ahead, she no longer felt like she was facing them alone. Richard's eyes softened as he reached over and gently took her hand. "I want you to know, Emily, That I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens next. In that moment, Emily realized something profound. She had spent so many years running from connection, from allowing herself to depend on anyone. But Richard had shown her that it was okay to trust, to lean on someone, and to let herself be vulnerable. And as their fingers intertwined, she knew that she wasn't just finding solace in his presence. She was finding something far deeper: love, trust, and the possibility of a future that she had never allowed herself to imagine. It was a cold, crisp evening when Emily found herself standing outside the door of the small house her family called home. Her mother had asked her to come by to discuss the latest updates regarding the debts, the payment plans they'd been negotiating with the creditors, and the looming threat of losing everything. But as Emily stood there, her breath forming small clouds in the chill night air, she realized that she wasn't just worried about the house or the debts. She was afraid of what might happen if she didn't let go of her past. The reality of what her family had gone through in recent years hit her like a wave, struggling to make ends meet, watching her mother break under the pressure, and always being the one to pick up the pieces. Emily had never truly had the chance to be anything other than the caretaker, the one who shielded her family from the worst of life's blows. But now, as she looked at the modest home that had always been a symbol of their resilience, she could feel the cracks, the fissures in her armor that were threatening to break through. And then there was Richard. He had been a constant presence in her life these past few weeks. He was there, supporting her through every step, never asking for anything in return. He wasn't just offering her his wealth or his influence. He was offering her something more profound, a safe space where she could be herself, broken and imperfect, without the fear of judgment. But as the days passed, Emily felt a growing sense of unease. She knew that her situation couldn't be fixed with his help alone. She was grateful, yes, deeply so, but there was a part of her that feared becoming too reliant on him. It was the same fear that had haunted her all her life, that if she didn't maintain control, she would lose everything. With a sigh, she walked up the steps and knocked on the door. Inside, her mother was waiting, sitting at the small kitchen table with papers scattered in front of her. Emily's heart sank when she saw her mother's worn expression, the lines of exhaustion deepening by the day. "Mom," Emily said softly, walking into the house and setting her purse down. "How's everything?" Her mother didn't immediately answer. She simply stared down at the papers in front of her, as if unsure what to say. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke in a voice that sounded far too defeated for someone who had once been so full of life. "We've managed to extend the payment deadline for another month," she said, her voice low. "But they want more than just money. They're threatening to take the house unless we give them something else. I don't know how much longer we can keep up this charade, Emily." Emily closed her eyes, trying to fight back the tears that were already threatening to spill over. She had fought so hard to keep this from affecting her, but the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. She had always told herself she could handle it, could solve it, but now, standing here in her mother's home, she realized that she couldn't fix everything on her own. "You don't have to carry this alone, Mom," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm doing everything I can." Her mother looked up at her, her eyes filled with sadness. "I know you are, sweetheart. But I can't help feeling like I failed you. You've always had to be the strong one, the one who keeps it all together. I don't know how you do it." Emily sat down across from her mother and took her hand. "You've always done the best you could, Mom. I don't blame you. But we need to find another way. We need to figure this out together." Her mother nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes was undeniable. Emily could see how much this was wearing on her, how the weight of their debts had chipped away at the woman who had once been so full of strength and spirit. Later that evening, Emily found herself back in Richard's apartment, her mind racing. She had told him bits and pieces of her family's troubles, but she had never gone into the full extent of what they were facing. Richard had been there for her in countless ways, offering advice, financial assistance, and emotional support, but now she felt the need to confess the full weight of the situation. Richard was in the living room, reviewing a business contract when Emily walked in. His expression softened when he saw her, and he immediately set the papers down, walking over to her. "Hey," he said, his voice warm. You okay? Emily forced a small smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine. I need to talk to you about something. Richard's brow furrowed with concern. Of course. What's going on? She took a deep breath and sat down on the couch, gathering her thoughts. My mom, they're threatening to take the house. The debt collectors, they want more than just money. They're threatening everything. Richard didn't speak immediately. Instead, he sat down beside her, his presence steady and calming. He reached out, taking her hand in his. I'm not going to let them take anything from you, Emily, he said, his voice firm but gentle. We'll figure this out. You don't have to do this alone. His words were comforting, but a part of Emily still hesitated. She had spent her whole life protecting her family from the worst of things, and now here she was, sitting in front of Richard, letting him into the most painful part of her life. I don't know how to let go of this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know how to stop trying to fix everything myself. Richard gently cupped her face in his hands, lifting her chin so that she was looking directly into his eyes. You don't have to fix everything, Emily. You don't have to carry this weight. I'm here for you. His words were a lifeline, and for the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe them. She had always been the one to keep it together, but maybe it was time to let go of that burden. She didn't have to be the strong one all the time. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice shaking. Richard pulled her close, enveloping her in his arms. You don't have to do anything right now. Just let me be here with you. And in that moment, as Emily rested her head on his chest, she felt something she hadn't in years: hope. It was faint, but it was there. As the days passed, Emily found herself slowly surrendering to the idea that she didn't have to be alone. Richard didn't want to fix her problems, but he wanted to face them with her. And that made all the difference. He helped her navigate the financial negotiations with her family, introducing her to his team of advisors and offering practical advice. He never overstepped, never pushed her to accept more than she was ready to, but his steady presence was a foundation she hadn't realized she needed. The evening was quiet in Richard's apartment, the city skyline shimmering through the large windows as Emily sat on the couch, her heart a tangle of emotions. For the first time in weeks, she felt like the weight that had been pressing down on her chest had finally started to lift. The storm wasn't over, but the clouds were beginning to break, and for the first time in her life, Emily didn't feel like she was alone in the middle of it. Richard had been her constant support throughout these turbulent weeks, never once demanding anything in return. He'd stood by her side as they worked through her family's financial crises, ensuring that the creditors didn't take everything they had. More than that, he had been her emotional anchor, showing her that it was okay to rely on others, that it was okay to let someone in. As she looked over at him now, seated across from her, Emily realized how much he had become a part of her life. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Richard had transformed from the charming, enigmatic CEO into someone she could no longer imagine being without. I've been thinking, Emily began softly, breaking the silence between them. About everything. About my family, my life, all the chaos. And you. Richard raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving her as he leaned back against the armrest of the chair. And? She hesitated, gathering her thoughts. I've spent so many years trying to keep it all together, trying to control everything. But I can't do it anymore. I've learned that it's okay to need help. To trust someone else. Richard's expression softened as he leaned forward, his eyes filled with understanding. You don't have to carry it all, Emily. Not anymore. There was a moment of silence, and then Emily took a deep breath, standing up from the couch and walking over to him. She paused for a moment, standing before him, and then without a word, she reached out and took his hand. The simple touch seemed to speak volumes, the trust, the gratitude, and the vulnerability that had always been so hard for her to express. I've been scared, Richard, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Scared of losing control. Scared of depending on anyone. But you've shown me that I don't have to do this alone. Richard stood and pulled her gently into his arms. You don't, he murmured into her hair. I'm right here. The warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against hers, soothed the lingering fears in her chest. Emily closed her eyes, allowing herself to be enveloped in the comfort of his presence. She had spent years building walls, telling herself she didn't need anyone, but now, in this moment, she realized how hollow that belief had been. What she needed wasn't control, it was connection. And Richard had given her that in abundance. I don't know what the future holds, Emily said, pulling back slightly to look up at him. But I want to face it with you. Richard's smile was soft, genuine. I'm right here, Emily. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. The promise in his words filled her with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. Whatever obstacles lay ahead, she knew that with Richard by her side she could face them. She had someone she could trust, someone who would stand with her, not to fix her problems, but to support her through them. The next few days were filled with meetings, phone calls, and planning. Together, they navigated the final stages of sorting out her family's debts. Richard's resources had provided a much-needed lifeline, but it was his unwavering support that had allowed Emily to breathe again. Slowly, the tension that had once gripped her heart began to fade, and she could feel herself loosening the grip she'd held on her fear and doubt for so long. Her family was finally on the path to recovery, and Emily had come to realize that while she couldn't fix everything herself, she could ask for help and accept it when it was offered. More than that, she could allow herself to be cared for without feeling guilty or undeserving. One evening, as Emily and Richard walked through a park near his apartment, the city's lights sparkling in the distance, Richard stopped and turned to face her. Emily, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I've been thinking about us. About everything that's happened in the past few months. Emily looked up at him, her heart in her throat. There was something in his eyes that made her stomach flutter with anticipation. Go on, she said softly. Richard paused, searching her face as if looking for the right words. I don't want this to end. I don't want to just be someone who helps you through a tough time. I want more than that. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what he was saying. A small, nervous smile tugged at her lips. Richard, I know it's not easy, he said quickly, stepping closer. I know that we've both been through a lot, and maybe this is too soon, but I can't help how I feel. I want to be with you. Not just for a few months, but for the long haul. I want us to be together. To build something real. The vulnerability in his words struck her, and for a moment, all she could do was look at him, stunned by the depth of his sincerity. Emily had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself from the pain of getting too close, from the fear of losing control. But now, as she looked into Richard's eyes, she realized that love wasn't about control, it was about trust. And maybe, just maybe, she was ready to let herself have that. I've been scared too, she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Scared of what this means. But I want it, Richard. I want to take this chance with you. Richard's face softened, and he gently cupped her face in his hands. Then let's do it. Together. The next few weeks passed in a blur of shared moments, laughter, quiet evenings spent in each other's company, and new beginnings. Emily's family was slowly getting back on track, and she was learning how to balance her newfound dependence on Richard with her independence. She no longer felt like she had to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. As she and Richard stood at the edge of a new chapter in their lives, Emily realized that this was only the beginning. The struggles of the past had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. And as she looked into Richard's eyes, she knew that together, they could face whatever challenges came their way. I'm not scared anymore, Emily said one evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city. Richard smiled, pulling her close. Neither am I. Together, they watched the sunset, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it hand in hand.